Hey, hit subscribe and leave a like. It lets us know you're enjoying these stories and helps us make more for you. And let's begin. I grew up in Boulder, but not the postcard streets where trailhead houses show off their gear like trophies. Our block locked the yard gates at dusk because coyotes treated cats like appetizers. You learned to carry a flashlight and keep your trash lid tight. Neighbors waved from driveways and then closed the door before real conversations started. Nobody wanted to be the first to admit that the perfect place had its dents. My parents fit the brochure on paper and missed it in practice. Dad ran a private therapy practice out of a rented office with a fake fern and a water feature that never quite sounded like water. Mom taught piano and violin, ran recitals in church basements, kept a pencil behind her ear, and a metronome in her purse. They were good with other people's families, calm, organized, patient. Then they came home and the air shifted, as if every unsolved problem waited in the hallway. They tried rules, no arguments past 9, no raised voices on Sundays, write the issue on an index card before talking. The index cards piled up in a drawer like unpaid bills. I learned the layout of the house through sound. The scrape of a chair meant we were starting another round. A quick laugh meant someone was trying to change the subject. Doors didn't slam. They shut with careful clicks that said, "We're civilized," even when everyone's pulse disagreed. Most nights I did homework at the kitchen table until I could predict the arc of their sentences, then slipped to my room with a notebook and wrote. Not fiction with dragons or space captains, just scenes. Who stood where, which word made things worse, how long the pause before someone apologized. I didn't know why I was doing it. I just felt better once the facts existed somewhere outside my body. By middle school, I carried small spiral pads everywhere, grocery lists that weren't mine, bus schedules, snippets of conversations I had no part in. The librarian asked if I was working on a project. I said yes because it sounded more respectable than telling her I couldn't stop recording things. Teachers liked the neat handwriting and the way I remembered dates. Friends used me as a calendar with legs. I never showed them what else I kept. The Thursday when Mom knocked a bowl off the counter and stared at the ceramic pieces like they had voted against her. The Sunday when Dad's voice went soft and soft hurt more than loud. Boulder gave me plenty to collect. Trail closures. A mountain lion spotted near the high school. A barista who wrote messages on cup sleeves like fortune cookies with better grammar. In a town that bragged about mindfulness, I felt like the person in the back of the yoga class who kept checking the clock. I didn't want to be enlightened. I wanted to know what was happening and when it would stop. Looking back, I can see the shape of it forming, how the habit glued itself to the part of me that couldn't tolerate mess without a label. At the time, it just felt normal, like brushing my teeth. If something made my chest tighten, I put it on paper. The page didn't push back. The page didn't try to fix me. On a winter morning in my senior year, I found a dead cat at the edge of our cul-de-sac. The collar said Poppy with a number I recognized from a few houses over. I wrote down the time, the location, the way the snow had a shallow scoop where a body had been dragged. Then I knocked on a stranger's door and told her gently. She cried into the sleeve of my coat, and I stood still because moving would mean I felt something I wasn't ready to name. Later, I added the scene to my notebook and sat there longer than I needed to, staring at the sentence. I did what I could, which was write it down. Back then, I didn't know that this impulse to log, to observe, to preserve would hold the map for a trip I hadn't imagined yet. I only knew that every time the world pretended to be fine, I had the notes to prove it wasn't. And that evidence, flimsy as it was, felt like a kind of spine. I didn't plan on working at the Community Culture Center after college. It just happened the way some turns in life do. One email, one interview, one, "Can you start Monday?" The place looked modest from the street, but inside it operated like a town with its own weather system. Flyers covered the walls, the HVAC hummed unevenly, and every room held someone rehearsing, arguing, or improvising a plan they'd forget by tomorrow. My title was Program Coordinator, but most days I felt like the person trying to keep a parade from drifting into traffic. The staff warned me early on, expect surprises. And they weren't exaggerating. The abstract painter who refused to wear shoes, even when the thermometer dipped below freezing, would wander through the lobby asking if anyone had seen his missing color. The local activist, sharp voice, sharper elbows, showed up to nearly every meeting accusing someone of wasting funding, even when the agenda was about landscaping. And the improv kids, high schoolers with bottomless energy, treated every hallway like a stage. They practiced dramatic reactions to imaginary disasters while spilling juice on anything flat. Week by week, I learned that the job wasn't about logistics as much as understanding the personalities moving through the place. If someone complained about a broken spotlight, they usually meant something else. If a volunteer missed a shift, it was rarely forgetfulness. Reading people became more useful than reading the schedule. I didn't brag about it, but I recognized the same skill from my childhood notebooks: catch the details, notice the shift in posture, file the information quietly. One Tuesday afternoon, late summer, crowded calendar, I was sorting equipment after a lecture when our director brought in a new volunteer. He was 19, tall but not imposing, with hair that caught the light just enough to seem slightly red. His name was Leaden. I recognized the city pool logo on his jacket. He'd been assigned to us for fall events because the aquatic center was overstaffed. He looked confident in the way people do when they haven't learned yet how stressful community programs can be. At first, I assumed he would disappear into the usual list of helpers: polite, temporary, interchangeable. But within minutes, he asked questions most volunteers never bothered with: how long the artist talks usually ran, which donors showed up unannounced, why the stage curtains had uneven stitching. He observed the room the way I did, scanning expressions before actions. When a guest speaker paced near the storage closet, Leaden murmured, almost to himself, "He's rehearsing an argument with someone." He wasn't guessing, he was sure. I didn't know whether to be impressed or cautious. It's strange meeting someone who thinks in shapes similar to yours. You feel seen before you decide if you like being seen. The following week, during a workshop, he noticed a child in the back row twisting his sleeves and avoiding eye contact. "Sensory overload," Layden whispered. He brought the kid noise-canceling headphones from the Lost and Found and guided him to a quieter corner. He didn't make a big deal of it. He didn't even look back to confirm he'd done the right thing. He just continued helping with chairs as if the solution had been obvious. After that, our schedules lined up more often. He'd drop by my desk at the end of events to ask if I needed help carrying props or packing kits. I tried to keep my guard up. When you work with dozens of people, you learn not to assign meaning too fast. But something about him made that guard blink. Maybe it was the way he observed without judging, or how he listened with real focus, not that polite nod people use when they're waiting for their turn to speak. On a rainy Thursday, he lingered while I wiped down tables. The storm made the windows vibrate just enough to remind everyone that the building was older than it looked. He pointed to a stack of programs and said, "You organize chaos like you've done this forever." It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't flattery. It was an accurate read. And accuracy can feel more intimate than charm. I didn't know then how fast our paths would tangle. At the time, it just seemed like another good shift with a volunteer who saw more than he said. But looking back, I can see the hinge forming, small, quiet, and steady, opening the door to everything that came next. The Kids Festival landed on a Saturday that started calm and fell apart by noon. Families packed the courtyard, someone's speaker crackled like a dying robot, and the inflatable dragon, our main attraction, looked stable right up until the moment it wasn't. One loud pop, and the thing began collapsing in the slow motion, twitching like it was trying to decide whether to deflate or escape. Kids screamed, parents shouted instructions nobody followed, and I felt that familiar spike of stress travel up my neck. I tried troubleshooting, find the tier, block the exit, keep the crowd from spiraling. But the dragon sagged faster than I could think. Then Leaden appeared beside me, calm in a way that never looked forced. He crouched, found a flap of loose fabric near the base, and taped it back together with the kind of focus people use when repairing something that matters to them. Every dragon has a weak spot, he said lightly. You just find the right one. It was a simple line, said without any intention, but it stuck. Maybe because it wasn't meant as wisdom. Maybe because it felt practical in a moment when nothing else was. After the dragon was upright again and the crowd settled, we stayed behind to clean up spilled snacks, paper crowns, and one abandoned shoe. Working side by side didn't feel staged or awkward. It felt like we had done this 100 times already. I noticed how he scanned the space before moving, as if solving a puzzle only he could see. He asked if the painter without shoes had shown up again this week. I asked whether the pool where he worked was as chaotic as our events. We talked like people who weren't trying to impress each other, an unusual kind of ease. Over the next few days, our conversations kept happening without planning. He'd help me box props after evening workshops. I'd sit with him at the lobby table while he finished drafts for his university application essays. He wasn't overconfident about school. He worried he'd look forgettable in a stack of applicants who all claimed to love leadership and personal growth. I read his essay about learning to analyze people's gestures during lifeguard shifts, and I told him the truth. He didn't need to perform insight, he already had it. He smirked a little, like he wasn't used to being taken seriously. Most people think I'm guessing, he said. You don't. Because you're not, I answered. You just pay attention? Our discussions drifted into territory most people consider too subtle to bother with. Why some people smile only with their mouth, why others move their hands when they're unsure, how groups fall into patterns without noticing. It reminded me of being a kid listening through the hallway wall, except now I wasn't documenting the tension. I was sharing the skill with someone who understood it without needing context. One evening, as we folded a backdrop curtain, he asked, Did you always read people like this? I told him I wasn't sure if it was a talent or a survival strategy. He didn't laugh, he didn't try to soften it, he just nodded in a way that acknowledged it as a real answer. Nothing about our growing connection came from flirting or hints. It came from navigating small disasters together, from the way he noticed the things others skimmed past, and from the quiet recognition that his mind worked in patterns familiar to mine. It wasn't romantic, not then. It was something steadier. Two people finding a rhythm in a place that rarely stayed still long enough for anything to form. At the time, I thought it was just a good stretch of weeks with an unusually perceptive volunteer. I didn't realize it was the beginning of a path we were already walking without naming, shaped less by intention and more by the chaos that kept pulling us into the same frame. By midsummer, my parents announced their plan for a week-long retreat in a remote corner of Idaho, the kind of place where the map shows one road, one river, and more elevation warnings than cell towers. They called it a reset. I called it a vacation with a limited escape routes. They were taking my brother and two of his friends, which meant the dynamic would be loud, unpredictable, and full of minor emergencies. They told me I could bring someone if I wanted. I wasn't planning to. Then I said Layden's name before I understood why. We were in the back hallway of the center when I asked him. I'd been sorting boxes of old programs, trying to decide whether they were trash or archives. He walked in holding a stack of extension cords. I heard myself say, "Do you want to come with us to Idaho next week?" The words sounded like I'd borrowed them from someone else. He paused, a quiet kind of pause, not surprised so much as processing. "I've wanted to go somewhere without noise for a while," he said. "Actual quiet, not the kind where you can still hear traffic." I didn't know how to respond, so I said, "There won't be signal." "That's the point," he answered. I told my parents he was coming. They liked him immediately. Dad said, "Volunteers with work ethic are rare," which for him counted as admiration. Mom just nodded with that approving smile she used for good students and competent interns. My brother didn't care as long as Leaden could lift heavy coolers and didn't judge his playlist. The drive took most of a day. By the time we reached the edge of the canyon, the late light turned everything dusty gold. The campground cabins sat on a ridge overlooking a stretch of water that carried cold air into the valley. You felt it the moment you stepped out of the car, now crisp enough to remind you that nights would drop into single digits no matter what month it was. Leaden took it in the way he took in most things, quietly, scanning the terrain like he was learning the rules before stepping onto a new stage. "You weren't exaggerating," he said. "It's a different world." "Different enough," I replied, though I wasn't sure if I meant the place or the fact that he was standing next to me in it. The first evening passed in that awkward way trips often begin. Everyone unpacked at different speeds. My brother argued with his friends about who got which bunk. My parents tried to make the kitchen workable, despite a stove that ticked before lighting. Leaden checked the fire ring for leftover embers like he'd done it 100 times. I felt responsible for him, though he didn't need managing. I just hadn't brought someone with me on a family trip since middle school, and back then it had been simple. Play games, share snacks, go home. Later, after dinner, he and I walked to the edge of the property, where the trees thinned and the river noise carried more clearly. Not silence, but a steady, natural kind of background. He stood there for a minute before saying, "It's easier to hear your own thoughts out here." I asked, "Is that good or bad?" He shrugged. "Depends on the thoughts." I didn't press him, and he didn't ask why I'd invited him in the first place. Maybe he assumed I had a clear reason. Maybe he was giving me space to figure it out. At that point, all I knew was that having him there felt right in a way that didn't fit neatly into categories. It wasn't romance, it wasn't obligation, it wasn't escape. It was something in between that hadn't decided what it wanted to be yet. That night, as everyone settled into their bunks, I wrote a few lines in my notebook out of habit. Nothing profound, just the date, the temperature, the way the river sounded from our window. Normally, these entries kept me steady. This time I hesitated before closing the notebook. Inviting him had changed something I couldn't name yet, and I had the uneasy sense that whatever it was, the week ahead would pull it into focus, whether I was ready or not. The weather shifted fast in the canyon. One morning, the air was bright and dry. By noon, clouds gathered low enough to brush the ridge. On our second full day, A thunderstorm formed out of nowhere. The sky went from blue to steel in minutes. My parents were out hiking with my brother's friends, so it was just Leaden and me near the riverbank, trying to decide if we had enough time to fill the water jugs before the rain hit. We didn't. The downpour arrived like someone flipped a switch, and we sprinted for cover while the wind tossed sand into our faces. He grabbed my wrist so we wouldn't lose each other in the sudden sheet of rain. By the time we reached the cabin porch, both of us were soaked, breathing hard, half laughing because the storm had dropped its entire weight on us without warning. He brushed the water from his eyebrows and said, "I honestly thought it would move around us." "That's wishful thinking," I said, pushing my wet hair out of my eyes. The storm passed in under an hour, but the runoff flooded parts of the trail system. That afternoon, my brother slipped while trying to cross a wet rock and dropped his backpack into the current. We scrambled to catch it before it floated too far downstream. Leaden got to it first, bracing himself on a slick boulder, hauling it out with both hands while the river pulled at his ankles. When he climbed back onto the bank, he looked calmer than the rest of us. "It's just water," he said, handing over the dripping bag. "You don't fight it. You adjust by midweek. We'd gotten lost once. The trail markers washed out from the storm and ended up adding an extra hour to a simple loop. A local family living out of a faded trailer pointed us back toward the ridge. They told us stories about hikers who underestimated the terrain. The details weren't dramatic, just steady reminders that wilderness doesn't negotiate. Everything that happened tightened the group, but it tightened something else between me and Leaden, too. We weren't performing trust. We were earning it the way people do when conditions don't allow for pretending. One evening after dinner, everyone drifted inside early. The temperature dropped fast once the sun left the canyon walls. Leaden and I walked to the river anyway, both of us wrapped in light jackets we knew wouldn't help much. The water moved slowly, dark and cold, catching the last bit of light. He told me he was nervous about leaving for the university, not because of the workload, but because he wasn't sure anyone there would recognize who he actually was. "I'm good at adapting," he said, "sometimes too good." I end up blending until I barely notice myself. I told him I felt something similar, just in reverse. That my life in Boulder looked correct from the outside, yet half the time I felt like I was performing a version of myself that didn't match what I wanted. He looked at me for a long moment, steady, not intrusive. "You don't disappear the way you think you do," he said. "Well, you just hide the parts that matter most." I didn't answer. I wasn't sure I could without giving away more than I meant to. When we headed back toward the cabin, he slowed, then stopped a few steps behind me. I turned, expecting another comment about the cold. Instead, he stepped closer, not rushed, not testing anything, just meeting me where I stood. He kissed me, brief, careful, nothing dramatic, but it carried all the unspoken things we'd been skirting around since we arrived. It didn't ask for anything, it simply acknowledged what was already there. We didn't talk about it on the walk back. We didn't make a scene of it either. Later that night, after everyone went to sleep, we ended up sitting on the cabin floor near the window, sharing the last of the trail mix and talking in low voices about everything except the kiss. We drifted into a closeness that wasn't planned and wasn't reckless. Just a quiet understanding that something between us had shifted. It was about the pull, the honesty, the decision to stay near each other a little longer than the situation required. It was the kind of night you don't label while you're in it. You only recognize later that it marked a turning point. The moment when both of us stopped pretending we were just two people thrown together by chance. Sunrise came early in the canyon. The cold settled in before I opened my eyes, the kind of cold that made you rethink every choice involving thin blankets. Everyone else was still asleep. I stepped outside to clear my head, expecting Leaden to stay behind, but I heard the cabin door open and his footsteps crunch on the gravel a moment later. We didn't talk about the night. We didn't need to. The air between us had changed, not heavier, just more deliberate. He walked beside me toward the river, hands in his jacket pockets, shoulders relaxed in a way I hadn't seen before. It felt like both of us were choosing careful steps, not out of awkwardness, but because neither wanted to disturb whatever had settled between us. When we reached the bank, the light was only beginning to hit the water. He crouched to touch the surface, testing the temperature the same way he'd tested everything else this week, while methodically, like he didn't trust assumptions. Cold enough to wake anyone up, he said. I'm already awake, I replied, which was truer than it sounded. We stood there a while before heading back. The walk wasn't silent in the uncomfortable sense. It was simply quiet because we didn't force conversation. Every few moments, I caught him glancing my way, quick checks that didn't try to hide themselves. There was no pretending anymore. The day unfolded with the usual chaos. My parents planned a short hike. Leaden and I convinced them to take an easier route so my brother's sprained ankle wouldn't get worse. A couple of miles in, we found a small dog trying to track its owners, nose low, pacing in circles. It wore a fading red harness and looked exhausted. Leaden knelt beside it and let the dog sniff his sleeve. He's been out here too long, he said softly. We carried the dog back toward camp until we spotted a pair of worried hikers calling its name. They thanked us repeatedly, more relieved than embarrassed. On the walk back, Leaden said, some animals panic when they're lost. Others freeze. People do the same thing. Which one are you? I asked. He thought for a moment. Depends who I'm with. By the time afternoon settled in, the atmosphere between us had tightened, but not in a way that made me want to retreat. It was the kind of tension that comes from knowing you're standing on new ground but refusing to rush your next step. Every look lasted half a second longer. Every small decision, who carried what, who walked ahead, felt charged without tipping into melodrama. That evening, my family played cards inside. Leaden and I stepped onto the porch, drawn out more by instinct than planning. The temperature dropped again, enough for our breaths to show. He leaned against the railing, facing the dim outline of the canyon walls. I keep thinking about last night, he said, voice steady, not testing boundaries, just stating what was true. So do I admitted. He didn't push the moment anywhere. He didn't step closer or ask for anything. He just let the honesty sit between us. And that restraint, that respect made the shift between us clearer than anything physical could have done. Before going in, he reached for my hand. Not dramatically, not as a signal to start a conversation we weren't ready for. Just a brief touch, warm against the cold air, like a quiet agreement that we weren't imagining what was happening. It lasted only a few seconds, but it landed harder than anything we said. Later, when everyone went to sleep again, we stayed up talking the way we had the night before. No dramatics, no overstepping, just two people who suddenly understood each other with uncomfortable accuracy. At one point, he said, it feels like we've been circling this for longer than a week. Maybe we have, I said. Maybe we just didn't notice. The canyon outside was dark, but the room didn't feel unsure. We weren't defining anything. We weren't rushing anywhere. We were simply acknowledging a truth that refused to shrink back to what it had been. And from that point on, every step we took, even the cautious ones, felt like part of a line we couldn't unwrite. The drive back from Idaho took the full day, the kind where everyone shifts in their seats every hour because no one can get comfortable. By the time boulder signs appeared on the highway, the whole trip already felt too far away, like we'd stepped out of a version of ourselves that only existed in that canyon. My parents chatted about laundry and work emails. My brother dozed with earbuds in. Leaden and I sat in the back seat close enough that our shoulders almost touched but didn't. Not because we were avoiding each other, but because we both knew the rules changed once the city reappeared. At home, the familiar routines kicked in immediately. My mom unloaded groceries she'd insisted on buying for the week ahead, even though we'd been gone for 7 days. My dad checked his messages before the suitcases were even inside. Layden helped carry things to the porch, thanked my parents for the trip, and gave me a look that said we'd talk soon. Not dramatic, not coded, just a quiet acknowledgement that we weren't done yet. The following days slid into something strange. We met up twice, once for coffee, once for a walk around the reservoir. Both times felt different from how things had been before Idaho. Not uncomfortable, just tense in a way that made every choice feel heavier. Conversations took more effort. We didn't dance around the connection between us, but we didn't name it either. It was like trying to handle something fragile without knowing how long you could hold it before it started to slip. And during one of our last meetups, he talked about packing for the move to Washington. He seemed excited about the campus, the classes, the clean break, but under that excitement was something else, anticipation mixed with unease. Starting over sounds good, or he said, but I don't know who I'm supposed to be when nobody has a version of me to compare me to. I told him that wasn't a weakness, just an unfamiliar kind of freedom. He nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. Before he left that day, he hesitated like he might bring up Idaho, the kiss, the nights we stayed up talking. Instead, he said, the trip felt real in a way things usually don't. It was, I said. He gave me a small, tired smile. That's what makes it complicated. The night before his departure, I opened an old notebook, one of the early ones from middle school. Between lists of forgotten chores and notes from school events, I found a line I didn't remember writing. People aren't afraid of losing others. They're afraid of being seen for who they actually are. I stared at the sentence longer than any other page in that notebook. It felt too close to what I'd been trying to avoid since we got back. The next morning, when I met him at the bus station, he looked different. Not dramatically, just standing straighter, carrying himself like someone who decided to leave before the moment made the choice for him. I handed him the notebook page I'd torn out. He read it once, then again. You wrote this when you were a kid? He asked quietly. Yeah. He folded it carefully like it wasn't meant to be rushed. You understood this way earlier than I did. We didn't hug for too long or say anything scripted. We didn't make promises we couldn't predict. He just pulled his backpack strap onto his shoulder and said, I'm glad I went on that trip. And I'm glad it was with you. I am too, I said. When he stepped onto the bus, he didn't look back immediately. Only once he'd found his seat did he glance toward the window, just enough for me to catch it. Then the doors closed, the engine rumbled, and the bus pulled out, taking him toward a life we both knew he needed to meet head on. Walking back through the station, I felt the shift settle in. Not heartbreak, not regret. More like the moment after a long conversation, when everything has finally been said. Even if the words weren't spoken directly, something between us had ended, but something else had settled deeper, like a line etched so quietly you don't notice it until the light hits it just right. Life didn't snap back to normal after Leaden left. It just flattened in a way I didn't expect. The Culture Center ran its usual string of events. The improv kids got louder, and the activist found new budget numbers to argue about. I handled schedules, emails, supply runs. I wasn't unhappy, just moving through days that felt predictable even when they weren't. Sometimes that predictability was comforting. Other times it felt like walking through a room with furniture I could navigate in the dark. Our messages faded on their own. No dramatic silence, no conflict. The time difference didn't help, and neither did the separate worlds we'd fallen into. Once in a while, he sent a picture of a foggy morning near campus or a cafeteria table, crowded with textbooks. I replied with snapshots of backstage clutter or late sunsets over the foothills. But the rhythms slowed until it became occasional check ins that didn't need explanation. Most days, I didn't think about Idaho. Then something small would trigger it without warning. A gust of wind strong enough to lift dust off the pavement. The chill of early fall mornings. A stranger's comment that echoed something he once said. Not romance, not longing, more like a memory that had carved its own contour and didn't plan to soften. One evening after work, I walked to the river path on the edge of town. The light hit the water in a way that made me stop, not because it was beautiful, but because it reminded me of how the canyon looked right before the temperature dropped each night. I hadn't gone searching for the memory, but it arrived anyway, bringing the steady feeling of that week back into focus. The storms, the missteps on the trail, the conversations that didn't hide anything, and the night we sat awake learning more about each other than we meant to. I realized then that the most important part of that trip wasn't the kiss or the tension or the uncertainty that followed. It was how he pushed me without trying to stop dodging who I was when someone actually paid attention. Back home, it was easier to slip into old patterns, play the reliable one, carry the details, keep emotion in check. In Idaho, none of that worked. The stakes weren't emotional, they were literal. You responded or you didn't. You paid attention or you got caught in the rain, lost the trail, or watched a current pull something away before you could grab it. A few weeks later, I cleaned out a desk drawer and found the torn notebook page I'd copied for him at the bus station. I'd kept the original. The handwriting was uneven, the kind you only produce when you're young and trying to shape letters into certainty. I read it again, this time, understanding why the sentence had lodged so deeply into me and why he'd paused after reading it. People aren't afraid of losing others. They're afraid of being seen, really seen. And once that happens, pretending becomes harder than telling the truth. Looking back, every small detail from the start connected cleanly. The dragon, the way he read people, the unexpected invitation, the storm, the nights in the cabin, the conversations at the river the moment he left. None of it felt random anymore. It felt like a line drawn without our permission, then handed back to us to interpret. I didn't romanticize what happened. I didn't rewrite it into something grand. I didn't need to. It mattered because it shifted something permanent in me, something I'd avoided naming for years. We didn't end up together, but that wasn't the point. The real impact was quieter, steadier, and harder to shake. Even now, when the wind hits just right or a trail shifts under my feet, I think about that week, not to relive it, but to remember how it forced me to stop shrinking parts of myself for the sake of looking well adjusted. It showed me that being understood doesn't have to be dangerous, and that trust built under pressure doesn't dissolve just because distance enters the picture. Some stories are short, but they hook into the structure anyway. This one did. And I'm still figuring out what to do with the part of me it pulled into the open